Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Season Starter Classes. Necromancer, I choose you! That's right. I want to be the very best, like no necromancer ever was. Looting and polluting is not my game. I recycle all my corpses. I will build a giant army and take them far and wide. Each skeleton is my friend. Yes, I am so lonely. Necromancer. So, why should you choose the Necromancer as your starter class for Season 1? Well, let's go over the Necromancer, shall we? And let's talk about him. So, the Necromancer in Diablo 4 is very much so like the Necromancer in Diablo 2. I've taken to the Necromancer quite nicely. I feel like the Necromancer in Diablo 4 is probably the closest thing I've ever come across to Necromancer in Diablo 2, and it was one of my favorite classes, which says a lot. Now, the Necromancer in Diablo 4 does have some differences, and all in all, as we go over it, I think you'll see that. So what is the Necromancer mainly? Well, he's a minion/caster. You can choose to sacrifice your minions if you so deem. You don't necessarily have to have any minions, so if you want to sacrifice them, you're totally able to just simply sacrifice them for bonuses. Now, is it always the best idea to sacrifice them? Not really. I mean, the minions do have their uses, like generating massive amounts of essence and giving you other bonuses, which are pretty darn nice, to be honest. And although sacrificing them can also give you some decent bonuses, it really kind of depends on what you're doing and like how you want to build your character. First off, you can build an entire character just around minions. There is a whole aspect and a whole way that you can just build your character around golems and skeletons and all sorts of other things. You can transfer your thorns to your skeletons. You can give your skeletons massive buffs through unique items and all sorts of other crazy things, which basically makes a very powerful character in general, but you kind of have to lean into the minions, like if you really want them to be super useful. As far as damage goes. Now, the really cool thing is you don't have to actually build for minions if you don't want to build damage. So, if you build minions without damage, what you're building them for is utility at that point, and they actually can be extremely useful in certain situations. Now, if you sacrifice them, of course, you're not going to get any utility out of them, but you can get extra damage and various other buffs. Now, what class builds basically are the best for a low-level character? Well, I actually already have a guide set up specifically for this, and in my guide, I go over the kind of characters that are good for low-level. So on my guide, you'll notice, and if you haven't checked out this video, I do have a season prep guide. For the Necromancer, early builds are Bone Spear, Blight, Corpse Explosion, and Sever. These are very good early game builds. Sever is amazing, Bone Spear is absolutely ridiculous, and Corpse Explosion is pretty darn good too. There's also the fact that you can pretty much just ignore your basic skill, so you don't even actually need to build a basic skill because of this beautiful passive right here, which is consuming a corpse generates 6 essence, which means that whenever you consume a corpse, whether it be by Corpse Explosion or whether it be by summoning another skeleton or mage or what have you, you can basically just replenish your essence very easily because of this. And it makes for a very powerful build utilizing the Grim Harvest passive. There are tons of different ways that you can build your character, utilizing skills like Decompose to generate large amounts of corpses, blood skills to suck the very blood out of monsters, overpower, like guaranteed overpowers, which is pretty cool. With the Paranormal Blood Surge that gives you an overpower once you get 5 stacks. And by the time you're done with all of the random abilities that you can use, like Corpse Tendrils, which sucks in monsters, and Bone Spirits, which do massive amounts of damage but consume all your essence, you've got some pretty solid characters. And basically, this particular character does have a lot of very good defensive abilities in the form of Blood Mist. The Bone Storm is absolutely amazing as both a defensive and offensive ability, including as a utility, which is kind of crazy. I absolutely love Blood Mist. If you're a Minion Mancer, you can utilize Army of the Dead to basically resummon your entire army at a whim. So even if your whole entire army dies, well then, oh well. There's also abilities like Death's Defense, which can be utilized to prevent your army from dying. So if you're going to go with the minions, definitely make sure you grab Death's Defense, because it's going to protect your minions from death. On top of this, there's also ways that you can get additional sacrifice bonuses with Memento Mori and things like that. So it's just another way that you can go that will give you additional damage reduction or additional damage in the form of, sacrifice bonuses. On top of this, Corpse Explosion itself also has two different ways you can go, which is pretty cool. So you can go with more like a Blighted Shadow Corpse Explosion or more of a traditional Corpse Explosion. And speaking of Corpse Explosion, it is a very fun ability to use and very much so reminiscent of Diablo 2's Corpse Explosion. Although I do still think Diablo 2's Corpse Explosion is better. If you build a full Corpse Explosion Necromancer, you can definitely make some very interesting builds. Bone Prison is also very interesting because there's a lot of different modifiers that you can utilize for it, and it actually makes the enemies vulnerable, which is definitely very nice. And speaking of vulnerable, all classes basically need vulnerable for their build. So how are you going to obtain yours? Well, Bone Spirit Necromancers get their vulnerable by having an aspect, which gives them a pretty large vulnerable for basically every single monster hit with that particular attack. There's tons of different ways that you can add in vulnerable to a build with the Necromancer, including, like I said, the Bone Prison, which is an interesting one. And if I believe correctly... trying to remember here. I was pretty sure there was one on... going over all the different vulnerable aspects are not always easy with this particular character. I believe Corpse Tendrils applies vulnerable, does it not? Yes. Corpse Tendrils is another way that you can add vulnerable into your build for 3 seconds, which is a pretty nice one. And honestly, I really like Corpse Tendrils. I think it's a very powerful ability in general. The Necromancer also has the ability to generate Fortify, which is another very important thing. So a lot of characters can generate Fortify. Some of them can't, like the Sorceress has really a lot of trouble generating Fortify. But the Necromancer, through the use of Necrotic Carapace, can actually generate a massive amount of Fortify relatively easy through the creation of corpses. If you take this passive, basically you can utilize things like Decompose, which allows you to get effects that way. You can also utilize the minions to generate corpses. So if you're utilizing, say, the Skeletal Warriors, which have the 15% chance to carve flesh off an enemy corpse, you're going to get a Fortify that way. You can also get Fortified by the Golem, which is every time it takes damage up 20% of its maximum life, it generates a corpse. And each corpse is generated, even the corpses that you generate through skills, will also add to your fortification, which allows you to use things like the very nice Undaunted glyph, rune gem glyph, the glyph, which gives you some damage reduction and even additional damage when you are fortified. In general, Fortify is one of those things that you definitely want to try and get if you can, because it just makes you super ridiculously tanky. If you can't get it, then oh well, but when the Necromancer has such an easy way to obtain it, it's just a matter of, just doing the right things so that you can activate it. There are some other ways that you can generate Fortify here and there, but for the most part, that's the main one on the Necromancer. There's also ways that you can beef up your army, so Skeleton Warrior Mastery, Skeleton Mage Mastery, you've got Golem Mastery, the ability to resummon your army, Kaelin's Edict, which gives you some pretty amazing buffs to your army, and so forth and so on. And as far as the key passives go, by the way, we basically have one for the minions, one for the shadow attacks, which is the Shadow Blight key passive, the Rathma's Vigor, which is the one that's specifically for the Blood Necromancers, and then, of course, the Ossified Essence, which is the one for the Bone Necromancers. This one's actually really powerful because it gives you a huge damage bonus depending on how many points of Essence you have when you fire the ability, and so it basically just gives you a massive damage bump whenever you're firing off the attack at full Essence, which is one of the reasons why you generally just build maximum Essence, like, to the moon and back, like, on all of your equipment. I don't actually have this character set up properly. I still need to get Essence Rings onto him, and that's one of the reasons why his damage isn't that high. But in general, when it comes to the Ossified Essence passive, the entire goal is to generate as much Essence as you possibly can here, so that you can keep this full, so that every time you fire, you have the large Essence pool, which gives you the larger amount of damage. Now, as you can see, I utilize minions in my build, but a lot of other Necromancers don't. It really doesn't matter all that much. You can either use the minions for the utility that they offer you, or you can sacrifice them and try to gain the damage bonuses. I personally prefer to have the utility. And it's really not that big of a deal. I pretty much one-shot just about everything that I shoot at anyway. I think I hit for like, my highest hit was like 11 million or something like that with the minions. Probably get even much higher without the minions, I would assume. Now, speaking of endgame builds for the Necromancer, let's talk about endgame builds really quickly. So, endgame builds are things like the Ring of Mendeln build, which does require unique items, so it's not going to be something that you're going to be able to build otherwise. The Ring of Mendeln is a special ring that I have right here. The Exploding Shadow Mist build, which is essentially utilizing the Blood Mist ability to explode corpses, and it leaves corpses behind as well, but it explodes and it reduces the cooldown, which allows you to spam it over and over again. The Blight Necromancer is a pretty powerful one too. I was having a lot of fun testing out that one, although I haven't done like a full build on it yet. Bone Spirit is totally a build that you can do. It's not really compatible with Bone Spear, but that's a whole other thing. I just talked about Bone Spear as well with the Ossified Essence, and Bone Spear is freaking insane. Summoner Druid, I mean, Summoner Necromancer. I don't know why I said Summoner Druid. Little Freudian slip there from Diablo 2. But you can definitely do a Summoner Necromancer if that is your bag. And then on top of that, I also know for a fact that you can definitely do a Sever Necromancer as well as a Blood Necromancer. All of these are definitely viable builds that you can have fun with. Endgame just doesn't really matter all that much. It's really just about focusing on a specific skill, picking something. Like, for instance, if I go through the tree and I just say, okay, I want to make a build around Bone Prison, and you're just like, all right, well, I'm just going to get all the Bone Prison aspects, and I'm going to find a way to make it work. And, you know, maybe you do. You know, or maybe you don't. I don't know. But if you focus on it, if you actually put all your effort into it and try and make it work, a lot of the times you can. Believe it or not. It's actually pretty cool in those particular games because you can actually make a lot of builds work that you might not otherwise be able to. Now, as far as the minions go, let's go over the minions real quick and talk about some of them. So the Reapers are my personal favorite because they create corpses, and they also do AoE attacks, which is pretty nice. But they also have the ability to gain a vulnerable, what is it? Reaper attacks against enemies who are immobilized, slowed, stunned, or vulnerable. Reduce the cooldown of their next powerful wind-up attack by 2 seconds, which increases their damage output. The defenders are very tanky in general, and they also have the ability to absorb damage by basically 1 hit every 6 seconds, which is pretty massive. So they basically just ignore 1 hit of damage every 6 seconds. Or you can set them up to increase the thorns that they give you. And that's a whole other thing with the Necromancer, is you can definitely do a thorns build, which is pretty cool. The skirmishers are more individual. You can get more warriors, or you can set them up for critical strikes. Basically, if you're set up for crit, the warriors are set up for crit, and they can get lots of crit damage too. The mages have their utility as well. The cold mages are my personal preference because they generate massive amounts of essence for you. You can also set them up to make enemies vulnerable every time they hit an enemy who is frozen, which isn't too amazing. But if you're setting up for frost damage, which is totally something you can do, by the way, utilizing the blizzard passive and some other things like the Bloodless Scream unique, which allows you to basically freeze or chill everything utilizing shadow skills, it could be a very interesting option here. The shadow mages are not my personal favorite, but they do have the ability to stun enemies on a regular basis, and you can set them up so they fire additional attacks. The bone mages kind of kill themselves. I'm not really sure what to think about the bone mages killing themselves because they kill themselves a lot. And I guess they create corpses when they kill themselves, but like, I don't know. They also have the ability to fortify. It says fortify you for 11% of your base life. So it is one way that you can add in more fortify into your build if you'd like to get a little bit of extra fortify. The only problem is when they kill themselves, you got to resurrect them. So the corpses that they leave behind often are, you know, kind of like just you use those to bring them back to life. So you're basically just remaking them from their own body. I don't know. It's a little strange. You can make them stay alive a little bit longer and increase their damage, or you can you can get the fortify option. Now, as for the golems, there's 3 different golems. There's the bone golem, which can give you more corpses, or it can also give you maximum life, or 10% maximum life. Amount of thorns they inherit from you is increased by 30% to 50%. So you can increase their thorns. This is probably the one you want to use with a thorns build. The blood golem has a pretty nice absorption. 15% of all the damage you would take goes to the blood golem instead. And then also, while you're healthy, your blood golem gives 25% damage reduction and 50% increased damage. You can, of course, sacrifice all these. Like, for instance, you can get 30% critical strike from the Iron Golem, which is why I'm sacrificing him. Every 5th Iron Golem causes a shockwave, which is pretty interesting. And then on top of that, you also have the Slam, also makes enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. So as you can see, you have a lot of different options to make enemies vulnerable. You've got the Iron Golem making enemies vulnerable. You've got potentially the Skeleton Mages making enemies vulnerable. On top of this, you can make enemies vulnerable with the Corpse Tendrils. You can make enemies vulnerable with the Bone Spear. You can make enemies vulnerable with the Bone Prison. There's a lot of various options on the Necromancers for vulnerable, and it's not bad. All in all, I think the Necromancer is a very powerful character. It's very difficult for me not to recommend the Necromancer because, quite honestly, he's just kind of broken right now. Now, when the patch on the 18th comes out, who knows what kind of balancing mechanics they might change. But for the most part, I do think the Necromancer is a solid starter character that can carry you well into endgame and has some very powerful endgame builds that can pretty much demolish even Uber Lilith. As always, I do appreciate you watching my videos, even when we're just talking about the master of the undead himself, the Necromancer. And, as always, keep watching.